Okay, welcome back to another episode of the Shed Geek Podcast. And as always, it's fun to talk about where I'm at and what I'm experiencing. I never could have imagined in the start of the Shed Geek Podcast I would be sitting inside of a bank vault doing a podcast. I'll tell you what, we'll go there. But Jonathan, you want to introduce yourself, who you are, your company, and sort of what you do for the shed industry?
Yeah, sure thing. And good morning, Shannon. Thanks for having me today. My name's Jonathan Williams, and I work at Cedar Grove Law, and we're in Hillsborough, North Carolina. That's where we are today in the bank vault here in our office. And we represent folks in North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, but mostly in North Carolina, all throughout the various stages and areas of the barn and shed industry. So
how did we end up in a vault? This is like a co-working space in a sense. And, I don't know how all of this works or fits in, but like we're literally, this had to have been an old bank at one point.
Yeah, exactly. What was, I'd say in the early 1900s, this building was built, and several of these on this road here in Hillsborough. Very old, historic town. A lot of history, a lot of character. But yeah, it was originally banked for a lot of years, and about 5 or 6 years ago, they renovated it, fixed it up, and turned it into the shared office space. And this was actually the vault where they would have kept the money. And so you can't see it now, but there's a vault door on the other side, and we're locked in.
We're in here. We're stuck. So all right, well, I love it. This is super cool. So Cedar Grove Law, tell me a little bit about it. What does that involve, and sort of what does your day-to-day look like with the shed industry? Because we've got an audience, it's growing. It's right at about 1,000 right now that we can measure. So there's a lot of haulers, a lot of manufacturers, a lot of salespeople and products and services in the industry that kind of listen in. Where do you kind of fit in on that niche?
Well, there's a lot of answers to that. It depends on the day. For example, I'll take you through past Monday. Get up. I have a case set in a county farther south. Probably been there before, Cabarrus County. Concord,
yes.
Salisbury, not far.
Yeah.
In that area.
Yep,
so
sure have.
Some days you get up, you go to court, and you have a trial. Usually it's trying to get a portable storage building back. You can go in, get judgment for that. So sometimes it's getting up, going there. Other times it's getting up and drafting leases, making sure it's compliant, meets the state regulations and rules. Every state's got different sets of rules and statutes. So, could be writing those, reviewing those, other types of contracts or agreements, fielding phone calls and emails. That seems to always, the thing you have to try to stay ahead of, right? They're constantly piling up. But, I would say a lot of driving, a lot of phone calls, a lot of emailing, and a lot of drafting, reviewing, and writing of contracts and agreements. Whether it's lease agreements, it's a dealer agreement, hauler agreement, the various agreements and contracts you'll see and use in the shed industry.
So what's really cool is that you were involved in that on a daily basis. Let's talk about kind of like where you got your start, like what made you want to like practice law? Like, cause you don't necessarily, I don't think a lot of people would say, hey, I want to go into litigation on, trying to get barns back. But there's a path that led you there. Kind of take me down that.
Yeah, sure. It's like everything, right? You don't always start or end up where you think you will.
Right.
And with law, I guess I'll go back to college. The honest answer is I wasn't ready to work yet. So, it's like I tell folks, I was like, well, what's the next closest thing to college? So I'll do 3 years of law school. And I stayed close by, stayed there in Birmingham. I actually took a little bit of time, went out to Tulsa, did a semester out there in Oklahoma. Got a little homesick, from a small town in Alabama, 45 minutes from Birmingham. I lived in Birmingham, went to school, and that seemed plenty far enough away, 45 minutes. And then when I made that jump out to Oklahoma, it was, a little too far for me. So went back home, got into school there in Birmingham at Cumberland, and just did law school, clerked some, worked some jobs. And when I graduated, I didn't really have a plan. About 2008, I don't know if you recall the the market about that time, the recession, and all these firms that were hiring lawyers no longer were. They were firing instead of hiring at that point. So it was kind of, counter to what I had intended. And it's like looking back at it, I was like, maybe I should have started working instead of going back to school. But everything's works out to the plan. And not my wife now, girlfriend at the time, graduated law school with me, was going to Nashville because she had been there, went to Belmont undergrad, and had ties there. And so I was like, all right, I'll go up there too. Not having a job or anything, just went on a whim. And when I got up there, I just started knocking on doors at law firms, looking up people, and somehow or another, I came across appointed work. You could go up to the courthouse and sign up to get appointed cases for folks that would otherwise go to the public defender, couldn't afford an attorney. If there was a conflict for some reason, meaning the public defender couldn't represent them for whatever reason, they get appointed to private attorneys. And so I signed up for that and went around, met all the judges, the assistants, and just, went and observed and just tried while I was waiting on my license. And I was valet parking at the time too, to keep us working as well. So, which I really liked.
In Nashville?
Mm-hmm, in Nashville. I was over at the Vanderbilt Hospital. When they would come and park, they had a valet service for some of the patients. Actually met some, was it Loretta Lynn, maybe a few, Jack White, a few artists, local folks.
I worked at a casino, and we had valet parking. So I was very involved with that. Met like George Jones.
Really?
Things like, it was like weird stuff. Like how weird that valet came up in this conversation. This kind of is blowing my mind already. And one of my friends actually went down to work for valet services in Nashville area. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, it's blowing my mind how things happen sometimes live.
Changed on us there.
Yeah. There you are.
Oh. We'll close it for now.
Yeah, all good. So, yeah, very interesting. And then, of course, Nashville. Love Nashville, obviously. I'm about 2 hours north, so always enjoy it. Being there. So you were doing criminal law?
Correct, yes.
Originally.
That's how I started, did that for several years, from 2008 to about 2016, for about 8 years total. Mostly appointed. Eventually, it was some hired defense work as well. But then when we moved back to Birmingham, I went to the public defender's office there doing the criminal defense, but at the public defender's office.
Okay.
So was in and out of jails and courthouses for a lot of years.
I feel like we could talk for hours. I actually, some of my early career started, so like my father-in-law was a prison guard for like 28 years. Excuse me, I can't seem to get over this either cough or sickness. And then my brother-in-law did the same and sort of worked in that field for a while. And that even actually led me kind of into, I didn't like the prison system because I didn't know that, like growing up, the movies depict what the prison system is, and you don't really realize it until you get into it. And I actually learned that like jail and prison was a business and not really anything else. And once you realize that, you're kind of like, whoa, wait a minute, is this? So I got stuck on these thoughts of like recidivism and how do we reduce recidivism? And well, the biggest cause for, like people going to jail was drugs and alcohol. So that kind of led me down a path to, like trying to help with, faith-based drug and alcohol rehab. Cause I thought, wow, like that's the source, like find the source, right? You can't just keep pulling bodies out of the water. You need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. So to me, that was kind of the thought behind it. It's like, let's find the source. So prison and even prison ministry became a big thing for me, and involvement with like Teen Challenge, and stuff like that. And I just believed in rehabilitation over retribution, and like, you know what I mean? Like this is all part of my life. So like when you talk about criminal law, it's all exciting to me to kind of think that's cool. But it got you in, you progressed, you came back and you went into the sort of the civil side.
Right. Exactly.
At some point.
Exactly.
Have you considered adding a line of shed accessory items to your sales lot?
Introducing Shedderize. Shedderize has multiple items to organize your customer's new shed. From tool shelves to workbenches with pegboard, 3-tier shelves, cord and ladder hooks, and more.
Shedderize is seeking shed manufacturers and dealers who want to partner and make these items available for your customers.
Dealers can order items for display, then complete an order form and have the items shipped directly to the customer. You can also purchase in bulk to add to your line of sheds or have inventory available right there at your sales lot. Installation is simple and takes just a few minutes for most items.
To know more, contact Dave Fisher at 866-548-1625 or visit Shedderize.com.
Shedderize, organization made easy.
And yeah, so now it went from all criminal pretty much with a few civil things, and now it's all civil.
Gotcha.
I haven't done any criminal matters in several years, but no, like you're saying, I saw it day in and day out.
Yeah.
There was no intention at the, jails other than just people there had jobs there that employed them, and it's a profit. I mean, those companies they're for profit. They're not non-profits running
Sure.
the jails or anything.
Sure.
And
I didn't know that, and
Right.
the movie doesn't, like I say, the movies don't depict that, so what people a lot of times know of jail is, they know what TV shows you, and so that must be it, and that's not it at all. It's
shocking,
It is shocking. I think it blew my mind because I was like, I don't think I want to be, there's got to be a different way, and for me it was about, 2/3 of the New Testament Bible is written from, prison cell, written from Apostle Paul, and even Hebrews 13:3 says, be with those in prison as though you're in prison yourself, be with those that are mistreated. And I thought, well, how is he relating the mistreated to the prisoners? Because how can the prisoner possibly be mistreated? And, of course, then I got called a lot of things, from hug a thug to bleeding heart, liberal, like everything, you know what I mean? Like
Sure.
I got called all of it because I was like, well, I just care for my fellow man. And,
Yeah.
There's some situations where lock them up and throw away the key. I hear you. But for the most part, I'm like, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to be like helping? Because 600,000 people get released from prison like every year. Like they go into your community, they go into your church, they go into your grocery store. I'm like, wouldn't you rather them have went through some kind of like rehabilitative process instead of just, some guy hollering at them saying you did wrong, so, you stink?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, can we do anything to like help this guy in his life? If you've got it figured out, do you have a social responsibility to help? What are we doing on this podcast right now? I'm not sure that we're talking rent town, but that's okay. I like it. I like where it's at.
I like it too. I was going to say, it's like you've hit the nail on the head too with folks about coming back in. It's like they're getting judged so extremely harsh or so harshly for their worst moments, right? Like that's not all their moments. Like you said, the fellow man, like I've had some bad moments.
Sure.
I'm thankful I'm not being judged and, held to the standards like
of that
for
one
the rest
moment
of my life, right?
Right.
That's all it takes.
Yeah.
And some people have harder lives and harder moments and more of them than others, and jail's full of that,
Follow this thought because it'll be true. Most people who will judge you for that one event would never want their one events ever put out there.
Exactly.
You know what I'm saying? Like the most people who won't give you the freedom from your one event. Even Jesus' brother didn't believe he was the Messiah.
Right.
No man is without honor except for in his hometown, among his family and his friends. If you want to figure out sometimes who doesn't believe in you, you're always going to be seen by somebody in the community as that idiot who, ran through my yard and destroyed my garden, and apple don't fall far from the tree. And, you're not going to be able to outlive those moments for some people. But when you find yourself in a new group of people, it's kind of like you're able to establish yourself completely again. And those people actually accept you.
Right.
Versus all the preconceived notions of your hometown, your family, and your friends sometimes. So, gosh, dude, I don't even know where we're going. I think it's Mark chapter 6:4, if I remember correctly. I'm not real good at quoting Bible verses, but I try to get the point, and I think that's better. So
that's the goal anyway, right?
Anyway,
the point, not the numbers.
So you're in civil law. You find your way into because what's fascinating to me is like you litigate, like in court. You actually litigate like these barn contracts.
Correct.
That's a huge wealth of knowledge because you've had to have spent massive amounts of time writing contracts, learning contracts, understanding the verbiage. I have been saying for a long time, the reason why I think the sales side of the industry is so unrepresented is because that's where the point of sales happening, right? And are salespeople educated enough to understand the very contract that they're selling? And what are we doing as rent to own or as manufacturing or any of that to make sure that that's understood? So we may be jumping way ahead here. But I'm just kind of curious at your thoughts on how does it go to where it ends up where you're standing in front of a judge? How does it get there?
Sure. And there's various ways to answer your question. The quick answer is lots of ways. Predominantly, it would be to recover property. Mm-hmm. You've got a lease to own agreement, for example, with a customer. They've defaulted for failure to pay. You've worked with them. Hey, you're behind. Mm-hmm. I need a few more weeks, a few more months. Work with them. And I never get these from folks that are like, oh, they're defaulted. Here you go. It's usually like 6 months, a year.
Sure.
Of forgiveness. They're trying to help me. Yeah. People are working with them, but at some point, time is money. You've got a product out there, a building that out of your possession, not bringing in payments, it's not doing you any good. But once you get that back, right, you know how it goes. You can then lease it. And so ordinarily we go to court because once they've gone to pick up the building, the person has refused and not allowed them for whatever reason. They could have built a fence around it, a moat, seen that, guard dogs, turned it into a recording studio. So you couldn't move it. It was all hooked up to power, And so you go to court, and it's civil. This isn't criminal. This is, you file a complaint to ask the judge to issue an order saying, hey, this company, this group has a right to their building. You're not allowing them to have it. Therefore, I'm going to order that you allow them to have it. And so it's a civil, legal order from the court, but you can then get the assistance of the sheriff to go with you because the first time didn't work right. You went out there on self-help, and so that's why you're in court. So that's generally and most often the times it's to go to court to get a judgment for possession. And sometimes that has to be done in court. We get to the trial part, and other times it can be done in motion writing. Like depending on the court, we can file and mail stuff off, which saves the client a lot of time and money of having to go to court, go back and forth. So that's one of the ways in which we would find ourselves before a judge.
So there's moments where the civil side can turn into a criminal then situation, right? Because obviously, whether it be like theft by deception or whatever, you know what I mean? Like you get into all these different terminologies, right? Per the law, certain amount of retail theft becomes, felony versus, a misdemeanor or something. And we're talking about large buildings sometimes.
Oh yeah.
I'm trying to gather all of my thoughts and streamline this into one direction, and there's literally 500 directions we could go. But I guess the questions I want to try and ask that might be the most valuable for the audience is, how do we do better? Because better might affect your ability to go litigate these cases if we're doing better. So how do we do better? How do we put you out of work, Jonathan? That's what I'm essentially asking, I guess.
That's a great question. And with that, we can apply that to the contracts too. And I think even more so once we get onto the contracts is, foreshadowing. The key is in the contract, right? The lease agreement. That's where you can really do, talk about point of sale, point of contact. That's where we'll call it point of contract.
Okay.
Play on words there.
Yeah.
But back to avoiding the litigation, some of that you just can't avoid, right? It's beyond your control. You can put this stuff in the contract that allows you to do certain things, but when you get out there and the person just outright refuses it, then you make a call. Is this something we want to pursue? And I always, from a financial standpoint, recommend it because the way, the cost of litigation to get it back, you're going to make that back once you get the building, release it. And then, so you're making money it's kind of like an investment, if you will, into litigation, like a litigation fund, if you will.
Hello from the Shed Geek. Let's take a walk through My Shed 3D. With My Shed 3D, your company can simply add a 3D builder button to its website. Once the customer clicks onto the 3D builder button, they will enter some basic information to get started. Remember, this information is captured in your Leads tab, whether or not the customer designs a building. This is very valuable information that turns a cold call into a warm lead. Next, they begin the design of their shed by selecting a primary use, a style, and a size that best fits their need. My Shed 3D has multiple styles that are available and consistent with traditional and barn styles within the shed industry. However, if you offer a customized or non-traditional style, My Shed Solutions can build that design for future use. We can also save on some design features that make it easy to adjust without a major rebuild or added fees for design changes. For instance, want to offer a steeper roof pitch? Just navigate to the Settings tab. Then click the Building Models. Click Edit Building and just enter the new roof center height, and the design changes will reflect on this style option. This will save you thousands versus traditional design changes that need to build a whole new style to match your design. From here, simply choose the style, siding, and color. Then choose a trim and roofing style and color. Next, let's add a door. That was goofy. Next, let's add a door. It is required to add a door to move forward with the design, as at least one ingress-egress option is necessary. Then add some design changes for personalization. Maybe some windows, or a porch, or some interior shelving. Next, just click Save Design and the customer will receive an automated text with all the features of the design to the email address entered at the beginning. From here, they can edit the design, view the details of the design, pay now to order the shed, or click Rent to Own to complete the necessary steps to purchase a shed they designed with My Shed 3D. The design enters the admin panel as a quote, and this is where the manufacturer can update the progress of the design once a deposit is taken. My Shed, from design to delivery, we have you covered.
So outside of your control, there's really, good contract, maybe on the front end too, in addition to the lease agreement, have a separate repossession agreement that spells it out even more clearly, so that in the event you go to get help, try self-help. We've had the sheriff come by because the customers called them. Like, hey, this person's trying to steal our building, and the sheriff goes out there and they're like, well, here's the lease, and also we had this repossession agreement. You signed this? He's like, sheriff says, well, you know what? I'm done here. Yeah. Feels like to me he's in the right. So the sheriff got in his car and drove off. Yeah. Without those agreements there, they've all right, you got to go home. Ma'am, sir, you can't be here. You're breaching the peace, trespassing, whatever, legal term the state has for trespassing. Sure. Seems like every state's got to come up with a new way, right? Yeah. That's what lawyers do. They got to come up with a different way to show how smart they think they are. But yeah, so that was a long-winded answer, but not a lot you can do. And then, like I say, I'll go back to the contract, and I think that's where really your lease agreement is so important.
Do you think the customers sometimes? So I've sold before, and I've been in this very situation where you're trying to do all you can to educate yourself on the product. You're trying to educate yourself. You're trying to be the best service person that you can and serve and help them in their need whenever they come in. What are they looking to buy? And then, there's you come in and you have a cash customer, and everybody loves a cash customer. You sell it, and it's done. It's over. You move on. But rent-own kind of falls under the ARPO. I don't know what you'd call it anyway, right? It's not standalone in rent-to-own. But then there's this other side of it that, so it has accountability through ARPO and the state statutes and whatever the state's attorneys and things like that set. And you want to try to keep that inside our industry, in my opinion, the best that we can, because the more organized you are, the better. And if that's why I believe in making a bigger pie instead of taking bigger, pieces of other people's pie. Let's make this thing really good and organized so that we all are doing better. The customers better represented. The companies are doing better, and your salespeople feel confident in what they're doing. But I've been in this situation where I'm selling, and sometimes you have impulse buyers, and a lot of times those that might shop on payments are very impulsive. So you have very little time to introduce your professionalism. You try to do all that you can to qualify the customer and all that, but they might be there and they're just looking for that, hey, tell me what I want to hear. I just need that payment information. I'm not willing to actually sit and listen to you thoroughly go through a contract. For me, what was very conflicting was I would almost become a financial advisor, because I would think that I knew what they needed or wanted.
Good point.
And so I'm trying to explain the contract, and because I'm trying to explain it, I'm trying to learn the contract myself. If you can't explain it easy, you don't understand it well. So for me, I'm trying to explain to them the contract, and rent-to-own works very much like a simple interest loan, right? But it's not. It's not a loan at all. There's no financial jargon that should even exist. This is rent. Right. We rent sheds. That's what we do when we put them on a contract. Can you expand on that a little bit? Like what rent and why rent and finance matter in law?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. For one, your treatment under the law. Certain regulations apply to one and not the other. We'll go ahead and jump here in North Carolina, for example. It's one of the few states that do not have a rent-to-own statute. So if you go to like Alabama, Tennessee, it's pretty well spelled out. And a lot of these are similar and the same in different states. And they talk to true leases, to rental agreements, right? Like you were saying, the rent. You rent. This isn't a security agreement where you have security interest or paying interest on anything. That's spelled out in a security agreement, which is totally different than a rental agreement or lease agreement. Now, there's some similarities, right? Like you're paying them in installments. You know, they're based installment type agreements. But North Carolina, for example, you can have a true lease, and if you do, you're essentially unregulated. But in order to become a true lease, you have to meet a certain statutory definition here. And there's what they call the Retail Installment Sales Act, RISA for short, the acronym. And I'm seeing a lot of this. Most rent-to-own contracts I see aren't true leases in North Carolina. And if they're not, then they're subject to the Retail Installment Sales Act, and they consider it an installment contract. So it's not a true lease at all, oftentimes. And you think it is because every other state you've ever been in says this is a lease, and it has been, right? And so you go 6 miles down the road, you're in North Carolina from South Carolina or Virginia to here, perfectly compliant contract, all of a sudden is exposing you to hundreds of thousands of dollars in liability and damages just because it doesn't meet this statutory definition here. So they can get you in a lot of trouble, for one, depending on where you are, if your true lease doesn't meet that state's definition of a true lease, if that makes sense. And then they'll treat it more like a security agreement, and then you're potentially violating all these usury rates, interest rate caps, because they're no longer calling that a rental fee. They're calling that security interest.
Because you can only make so much on the price of it. So let's call it what it is. Like a lot of times, if you've got, say, good credit, established credit, the purpose of that is it shows a history. That's why history is important, is it not, in our lives, but also in our work and in our credit as well. It shows patterns.
Indeed. And
if patterns show that, say, maybe you haven't paid back what you've been loaned, then it shows you unfavorable per your credit score, your FICO score. You know what I mean? It's gonna, hey, you have a history of not paying. So rent to own to me is kind of looked at in some ways as like a much riskier, but it offers you a path to ownership to a product. With that being said, there are caps that you can put on how much you can make on that. Hey, there's a bigger risk, so there's a bigger reward. And so for anybody who says, oh, it's predatory, it's like, well, there is a bigger risk for a bigger reward. That's the same outside of sheds. That's the same in the world.
Right, exactly.
Just ignore rent to own and say there's always risk and reward to consider.
Yep.
Hey guys, this is the Shed Geek, and I'm here to tell you about the latest in financial innovation to hit the shed industry. It's a program called Backyard Finance. Everywhere I go, shed manufacturers and shed sellers are always asking, how can I get a better payment option for my customer? At Backyard Finance, they're making this a reality. You might be asking, how do I sign up? Simple. Just go to Backyard Finance, click on the Get Started Now button, and create an account. After that, you'll have 200 plus banks competing to give your customer the best financial terms possible. With Backyard Finance, you can service your customers two ways: direct to customer lending or direct to merchant lending. With direct to merchant lending, simply fill out an application. It takes about 2 to 4 weeks to process that application, but it'll allow you a variety of financing options to make you a more competitive retailer. With FICO scores as low as 500, 600, or 700 plus, your customers will receive financing options with APRs as low as 2.99% or as high as 29.99%. Credit applications are approved in just 15 to 45 seconds. To know more, contact Backyard Finance at 833-692-2286 or email info@backyardfinance.com today. Backyard Finance, funding backyard dreams.
So whenever folks come in and they may have stressed credit or they may have poor decision making or bill paying history, a lot of times you'll know this if you've been a salesperson, because every one of you that's listening has experienced the situation where you say, have you considered a cash option? Well, I haven't saved the money to do that. Well, have you considered going to a local bank or credit union and getting a lower interest on a finance rate? Well, I don't have the credit. Okay, well, then without rent-own, you have no option. So rent-own's here, but now you have to consider. I mean, there's EPL, there's early payoff with it. There's all these other things, but it does exist and it's here. So here you go. Here's an option for you. Then is that customer going to take the time to learn? And really, in some cases, is the dealer going to take the learn? And I'm going to get in trouble for this comment. Is the manufacturer going to see to it that he has educated the dealer so they do at least know what to explain? Because a lot of guys are just ready to get their 10% if they're selling a shed, and they really don't care about the law,
right? Sure.
or the rent-to-owns companies. So that's where I think that the education segment is missing, and that's sort of some of the stuff we want to bring to the table at times.
Sure. You touched on something I think very important there too, is that the risk and reward, right? And that's part of the rent-to-own rental industry, is that you don't have the securities that you have, like UCC filings. If you had a security interest, then you've got some more protections. You can go in, you have more repo options too. But like you said, that's not what we're doing here. We're doing this other option. So we know the risk. We choose to accept the risk. Right. And I've, oftentimes hear like attorneys that'll represent, customers or another party that I'm involved with. They'll say, well, that seems like a really risky business. That's a poor business model they have there. I'm like, look, it's clearly not your business model. I appreciate your advice. I'll pass that along to my clients and let them know, that you're concerned about their industry and how they're operating their business model. But they're like, well, I don't know why you're trying to get this building back. It's not worth that much anyway. I'm like, fair market value to you, it's probably not. But you're also not in the business of renting to own or leasing these buildings. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so there's all sorts of ways of seeing value. Right? Yeah, you're right. There's such a just very focused and narrow, here's a building worth X dollars, and that's all they see, right? Yeah. And it's so much more than that. And so I know, looping around the question about educating and giving the folks the tools and information, you can only do so much, right? Like, here's the lease, here's the agreement. Like, are we supposed to, as a dealer, like, talk them out of it? Or, like, at what point are we not doing our jobs, doing well? And so, you have the agreement there. Everyone has the ability and opportunity to read it. If not, that it says, in the agreement, spells out the terms that you've read it, you've signed it. I think keeping those concise too, right? Like, you don't want to paralysis by analysis. So keeping the agreement to the basics without a bunch of wordy legalese. And that's what I try to do in writing these agreements. I recognize that. And that's something I've heard from folks all throughout the industry. They're like, man, I don't want like a few pages. I just need like a sheet or two. I'm like, I got you. I know what you're saying. And so you go through and pull out a lot of the stuff that's on these form contracts. It's just clutter. It's just jargon. Yeah. It's just a lot of clutter, boilerplate, not serving anything other than taking up space on paper. Yeah. I can only explain it to you. I can't understand it for you.
this is like the way my mind works as a salesperson. Like, if you want to know more, I'll go there with you to try and explain more. But let's be honest, the customer typically doesn't do their due diligence. They trust. They buy from who they trust. People buy from who they trust. And once you've earned their trust as a salesperson, they're going to trust that what you're saying is good, but they're going to make tons of assumptions
Sure.
early on. So when you sign the contract, all the law says is that we have to include it. We have to, what's the word I'm looking for? Divulge that information or whatever. It has to be present so that you understand if a building's $5,000 and you pay the total rental fee on it over a period of 3 years, maybe it's $8,000 in total cost. That has to be explained to you. It has to be present. It has to be on the contract per the statute or whatever. But I don't actually, as a salesperson, have to understand it for you. I can show you, but as a customer, a lot of times they're just so ready to buy, and the salesperson is just so ready to sell. The details of the contract, they're not priority.
Right.
They're not priority. So I guess I'm just thinking in my head. I think for me, that's where I ran into a lot of issues. I remember very clearly talking to customers and saying, "Oh goodness, can we get you in a smaller building? You've given me your budget. I think that the smaller building's gonna meet your budget, even if it doesn't meet your need. It's gonna at least take a burden off of you to have some space." And they just get frustrated and say, "No, I mean, it's no credit check. All I've got to meet is the standard, which is the down payment. Here's my down payment. Why won't you sell it to me?" And once I get to the point of being questioned, when you're trying to offer assistance, but you get questioned or accused of something, it's like, you know what? Here you go. Sign away right here, sir. Building comes back in 6 months. And that particular customer pulled a gun on the hauler. And it's like, wow, I tried to avoid all of this.
Yeah.
So I felt like this was going to be a train wreck at some point. But we get in trouble assuming those things, right? Because I've also had people come in and buy, and to be honest with you, the prejudice in my mind takes over, and I say, this guy's not going to pay for this building. And he pays it off in a year and comes back and buys another one.
Exactly.
So,
exactly right.
I don't know where I'm going with it other than these are real life situations that happen. Drop some knowledge on me, dude, in the industry for what you do litigating law for rent-own. Kind of just take the mic and tell me, you can tell me your story, but I'm curious about how we do better and how I help you and how you can help the industry.
Sure. I've talked a little bit about the recovery side of it already. I think now's probably a good time. We've talked a little bit about different states and their rent-to-own statutes and ones without it. Right here in North Carolina is kind of the hotbed. This is where a lot of litigation is going on, where some lawsuits have been brought or being brought against various rent-to-own companies, manufacturers, distributors, dealers. Even some haulers have got lumped in for that. Some of them, they'll just sue everybody before they see a name on a contract or paperwork along the way. They'll throw in a conspiracy or some sort of colluding type allegation and say that they're all working together, in cahoots with these contracts that are quote unquote illegal under North Carolina law, and they're bringing more and more of these. And so what we're doing in those, where we can help is represent the parties that have been sued by these plaintiffs' attorneys. And the folks bringing the suits are customers. It's the customers who have normally a lot of these generate in bankruptcy court. And that's another thing we can talk about a little bit is how to file claims for, in bankruptcy court so that you can still be getting paid. Like just because you see someone file bankruptcy, not all is lost. You can go file a claim and get paid under the bankruptcy plan. And, that's something else we help folks with too. But some of these attorneys will catch these, they'll get the debtor customer. They'll become the customer will be the debtor in bankruptcy court. And they'll get an attorney assigned to them, and they represent them through bankruptcy. And so they're going through and reviewing the various documents. They're like, what about this lease here, this rent to own? And one in particular and a few others have discovered that, wait a minute, this doesn't mesh with the RISA, the Retail Installment Sales Act in North Carolina.
Hello, Shed Builder. With each new year, builders are searching for ways to increase efficiency and safety. Simply put, the Joey Pivot Lift is an investment into your building crew and your bottom dollar. Manufacturers are able to save hours and dollars by making painting, decking, and roofing a safer and quicker process. The Joey Pivot Lift turns 360 degrees inside of a 50-inch radius and lasts an average 8-hour workday before needing charged. It has a minimum platform height of 61.5 inches, allowing you to reach into areas with ease versus the traditionally used 6-foot ladder. No tripping or falling hazards exist, and no need to climb down and restock. For roofers, simply load your metal on the lift prior to getting started and throw your roofing screws into the built-in tool tray. Pricing is just $8,295 for the 60 series, $9,685 for the 70 series, and $10,675 for the roofing model. For exact pricing that includes tax and delivery to your door, contact the Shed Geek at info@shedgeek.com or dial 618-309-3648. We're raising building standards with Joey Pivot Lift.
So they're from the bankruptcy court mostly, have gone and then filed the adversarial proceedings in court instead of the bankruptcy's federal court. Some of them are filing them in federal, some are filing them in state. And some of them, they're alleging class actions. They're going out and saying, hey, we believe there's a whole lot more of these out there.
Oh, wow.
And so they're trying to get them certified as class actions. And what that means is it just gets a whole lot more expensive and a lot more folks involved. And once it gets certified, they don't have to do all the work, right? They don't have to go through and get every individual. They're like, we're going to say it's this many people. And it's just a matter of calculating, right? Does your calculator count that high?
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah, and then you settle for a big number somewhere, and then most people don't even, go after their claims if they were part of that class action, right? Like,
Right.
And to put that into real life terminology, if any of you've ever gotten something in the mail that says,
Exactly.
Hey, this company is being sued and you could make a lot of money out of it. You just got to do these things. It's like, you may have bought this product. You may not have. But
Yeah, and you essentially can opt in or opt out, right?
Sure.
Like if you ignore it, you by default opt out or check this box, opt in, and you get your $7.54.
Right.
And they cut the settlement checks.
Sure. That's exactly the way it works. It's how crazy to think that could even be happening and that there's got to be ways to increase education to stop, that threat or whatever from happening. I don't know what that looks like. For me, I think the fragmentation of the industry plays a big part in it, and I think that's because we see consignment dealers, consignment model, which I still think is extremely peculiar. There's really no other industry that does what we do in terms of consignment, like to not floor plan or net 30 or 60 or 90, but to bring you $100,000 worth of inventory and give you a 10% or whatever your payment structure is to sell it. And in most cases, very little accountability if you don't. And then you have, like awesome people who fit those models that do crazy, amazing numbers and jobs. And they like the comfort of not having to, build their product. And then you have others that choose, a wholesale model and want to buy and resell, and they don't want to use MSRP. They want to create their own. And so it's so fragmented. And then there's company owned, right? And there's just so many details to the industry that I think that kind of plays some conflict in synergy. Mm-hmm. Would you say? I
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, you go back to the beginning of the industry, right? It was more like the family dynamic. You've got pretty much everything was together. Everybody was communicating. And like you said, it's kind of grown and you've got this fragmentation. Not everybody's on the same page necessarily. I do find that there are some issues and problems, especially with the communication up and down the lines, particularly here in North Carolina. What was it? Something came up the other day I was thinking about. It's just there's a lot going on and a lot of I don't know. What's the word I'm looking for? there's just some like disrupted connections, I feel like, across
Yeah.
some areas. Like
Yeah,
some
I
frayed
think-
lines or something.
I think that happens with people in business. I mean, I think that's just what it boils down to. Like, I've been told maybe 5 or 6 times in the last year, that's just business, Shannon. You have to understand that's just business. And the same people usually tell me, hey, I'm all about the people. I don't even really care about the business. So it's, you know what I'm saying? Like the message is, I'm all about the people. It's the people. It's the people. The people matter. You know, we're people business, and I believe these to be good people. And then when the fragmentation or the distance you're talking about happens, then the conversations turns to, well, that's just business. I mean, you have to understand that's just business. And I've never really been. I've told a lot of people I'm not really a that's just business kind of guy. At some point, all of my life kind of integrated. It was very difficult for me to keep, say, my religious opinions separate or my, walk with Christ different from my work. A lot of people do that. Hey, you clock in. Hey, you go to church on Sunday. You put everything into these categories, and you leave them in those categories. And for me,
Compartmentalize everything.
Yes. And for me, it's just easier to be like, hey, I, walk with Christ in my daily walk, but then that also affects my work. And I can't keep the two of them separate. It's why I pray on the podcast. It's why I talk about it, because it's very difficult for me to keep those things separate. That one affects the other. So it's easier to just be transparent and say, hey, this is why I'm thinking what I'm thinking. And so it can't be just all business to me. There's a very personal aspect to the side of things. And it's hard for me to be like, business.
Yeah, totally.
That's it.
So let me ask you this too. Think about this for a minute. Here's something I've came up with over the years, and it's observation I feel like I've made of myself, and I feel like it's pretty accurate, is that some of my worst human personal traits are what make me a great lawyer, and vice versa. Think about that for a minute, and separating business and personal. So one of the things I realize is, man, I need to turn off the lawyer hat, because I'm a little aggressive here, a little bit adversarial, and it just doesn't always sit right. Like you said, it's like I feel there's a lot of conflict at times, right? Especially in the litigation industry, because by the nature of it, it's two sides that are adversarial oftentimes. Now, that's not all my practice. Like I said, we've got the compliance, the contract writing, the lease agreements, the negotiations that go into just setting up the business formations, right? That's a great side of it, and that's fun because that's good. I get to help people without having to have an adversary. And so
you're kind of blowing my mind right now, because even one of the things we talked about early on was we didn't want to be preachy on the podcast, and I feel like I'm getting preached to in a good way. So take that as a compliment.
Okay.
Take that as a compliment.
You always cut it if you need.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I feel like it's in a good way, because Jonathan Ulrich he told me one time, he said, you're really, really good at reading the emotional energy in the room. He gave me that compliment, and I thank him for it. And I'd agree with him. He's an awesome guy. And when you made the comment, some of the things that's made you a great lawyer, I have also miscommunicated terribly. So do you want to talk about how difficult it is when communication is imperative to what you're trying to accomplish, when what you're really good at is you make, say, a wrong decision? Because when you think you're right, you're just going to keep going. But what I'm trying to say is, I've been told even my whole life, your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. It's true. Your communication is you blow me away with your communication, and then you make me scratch my head with certain things you do. And I'm like, hey, it's me. It's who I am. And I don't know how to change it. I don't, I don't know that I'm trying to, or that I need to. So I love this conversation, dude. I feel like me and you can talk forever. Maybe we're boring people. Hopefully we're educating people. Hopefully we're giving them entertainment, something to laugh at, something to take and consider and ponder and think on. A lot of people get into the shed industry and they say, oh, rent to own, that's where the money's at. I notice they never say, "Oh, rent to own. That's where the risk is at. I want to go there."
Sure.
They look upon it positively and kind of ignore the reality. There's this whole other thing, large risk. So what advice do you give to like a manufacturer? We're starting to see more and more people who want to do an internalized rent to own system as opposed to using a third party. Where's the risk there in doing something like that? If you're a manufacturer or a mom and pop.
I think it's the biggest one is just trying to do too much, right? You've got folks that, it's something that's like it's like at home too. It's like, at what point do I draw a line? It's like, I can do this, and I can do this. I think you just got to look at how much manufacturing are you doing, like in that example. Are you looking to grow? Are you looking to expand? Do you have a desire to do this? And what is that desire? Is it also beyond just the income too, right? I think that's a very important question. Everything's intertwined. And if you want to, it's hard to compartmentalize. It catches up with you too, by the way. Like me being a great communicator, or at least I think I am. I try to sell that. If not, I'm not doing a good job to folks. But I'm not a good communicator at home. Like, I wall up, like our strengths and weaknesses. I wall up, hole up, just try to internalize too much. And so it's one of those things where it's like, all right, it's one of those self-recognition. I think you've got to look and see. Because once you start taking on that extra, the rent to own, there's a whole nother world out there. And there's folks that specialize in just that, right? Like, you could do a lot of your contracts yourself, all these things. It's like, but, there's folks like us that do that for a living and do that for a job. Same with rent to own now. It's at one of those places where if you're going to do that, have a person or two that's going to be in on that too and be able to dedicate to it. Because it takes your full attention.
Stephen Byler talked about being vertically integrated. When you own your own manufacturing, you own your own sales lots and processes, you own your own hauling equipment and employees, you own your own internal rent to own. It's about scaling at that point then.
Exactly. But yeah, but mainly, on that note about scaling up, it's like you've got to, it takes on a lot. You don't need me on here telling you how to run a business, right? Like, that's not the thing, But from what I've seen, the ones who do it well. They invest in it. They realize it's going to take more. It's not just the same. You don't just keep showing up to work and you decide to do something different and it's going to work. It's going to take more people. With that, you have employment law coming in. You have more contracts, potentially, depending. Hopefully not as much if you don't have to deal with as many folks, but there are HR considerations. If you're going from manufacturing to rent to own, now you're getting into that state regulatory compliance with the rent on statutes or lack thereof if you're in one of the 3 or 4 states that don't, like North Carolina.
What are some of the other states that?
I think Wisconsin may not.
Yeah, I think, like, is it Minnesota that there's no rent to own? It's not an option. They won't allow it. I think Indiana has some. New Jersey has some different statutes.
And some of them are pretty peculiar. I mean, a lot of them, there's a lot of consistencies.
What happens there that a state an AG would maybe create a different? The AG would be creating the statutes, right?
Well, no, they could interpret them at times, but it would be the Congress, it'd be the Senate. They would pass the law, so it would be the statute is essentially the law. So you'd have the statute that comprises, like the rent to own statute or act. A lot of them may call them an act. Some of them call it that. And so within that, it'll set out the parameters, like marketing. Probably seen those, with how you can market them, what you have to include, consequences, potential violations. So a lot of the states are very similar. Some states just copy each other. Others, they've got to do something.
And the more regulated it is, the more you're going to see that. That's why you have things like state boards and things like that if you're an insurance agency or a money manager or something like that, right? Like, you have to pass certain certifications that say you understand how certain things can be marketed.
Right.
You can't say certain things in certain marketing campaigns because it's misleading, right?
Exactly.
Or predatory or whatever.
And some are very specific. Some have the exact language you have to use.
Yeah.
You depend on which state you're in. I know Virginia, West Virginia, very regulated, very strict. Those are a couple that are close by that be careful, watch out.
What happens to create those strict regulations?
How they get there?
Yeah, is a litigation situation that turns into a nightmare for Congress, where a lawyer comes out and says, "Hey, I'm right on this, and this is and it goes to the court, and the court agrees, and they say, oh, I'm going to use the power of the the state government then to change that."
Sure. Couple ways. That's one. You see some litigation, right? Some lawyers get a hold of like, ooh, we find this nice violation of law. At least we interpret it that way. And whether they're right or wrong, it's going to cost money to fight it, to win or lose.
Mm-hmm.
And, as they say, when that happens, there are no winners and losers except for the lawyers. They're the ones that really win from it.
Yeah.
Mostly losers.
Yeah.
Also, big lobbyists, I would say. And I would think the biggest ones are the consumer protection lobbyists. A lot of this is derived from consumer law.
Mm-hmm.
It falls within that category generally, that umbrella. So you have a lot of folks that, depending on what state you're in, some of them are more protective than others that require more disclosures, less rental fees you can charge.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of fees that you can charge in certain states that may vary, right? I mean, like the audience might not be aware of that, and several are like, oh, I just thought that was common among everyone in the industry. But there's only a certain amount of gain,
right,
that you can have, and that is set forth by Congress.
Yeah, exactly. And so that would be in your state statute, and that would be one depending on what state you're in, and you're looking at scaling up. Well, what does the Rent to Own Act, the law, say about it here?
Mm-hmm.
And so you want to go look at that, and it may not be worthwhile. It may, just depending on.
And it's kind of painted with a broad brush of rent to own. Rent to own kind of falls under like these big broad categories, probably whenever you end up in court.
Sure.
I'm assuming.
Yeah, and that's another time in which I'm finding myself doing the educating, right? Like that's where I get to go out, and I'm sure, folks here in the industry realize it at times. It becomes second language. Certain terms you use, the way things work, and it's just like you say something, and that someone that's not in the industry looks at you funny. You're like, well, duh. You know what I mean? Like, what do you mean? I mean, I just told you. But no, you go into court, and judges, they're like, well, son, this wasn't in the UCC filings. Like, judge, this is a lease agreement, therefore it wouldn't be under the UCC. He's like, well, how do they expect to get it back? I'm like, nicely say, well, that's why we're here, Judge,
Yeah.
but without saying that exactly to them. So you're like, well, Judge, under these circumstances, we've made, multiple attempts, and you lay out the track record of how many times you've let them, promise to pay, not pay, and the second, third, 15th, second chance they got.
Yeah.
And then at that point, after I've had a little bit with the judge, his focus shifts on the customer. Like, you mean to tell me you're lucky I don't lock you up here today? I was like, Judge, it's just civil court. We're not asking anybody to be locked up. But haven't had that education session, right?
Yeah.
That judge knew something then going forward, and they've probably told somebody, like, I had this Shed case. You believe this here the other day? And then so I go all over the state. I'll go in. I've been in, there's 100 counties in North Carolina. I've appeared and practiced and tried cases in 81 of them, plus the Cherokee Tribal Court. So I've only got 19 more to go. And one of the coolest things for me is to go into court, and they're like, hey, it's the barn guy. It's the shed guy. You know what I mean? Place that hadn't been in months or years. And they recognize me.
That's awesome.
The smaller counties, obviously. And those are always my favorite, I'm from a small town. We're up here in Cedar Grove. It's really small. Hillsborough is too. And it's great. But for us going into court, educating, they would have not known about these things, right? So
it's as if your goal is to take the judge's 30,000 foot view and bring it down to a 5 or 10,000 foot view, so he kind of understands, because he's painting it with that broad brush of like, UCC filings and all this, and you're like, in a kind way, Judge, that's irrelevant. You know what I mean?
Right,
that's
exactly.
sort of, you know what I mean? It doesn't really affect what we're talking about here today. And gosh, what a challenge to try and like do that, because he's in a position of authority.
Speaking of the communication thing, right? Like you choose your words carefully.
Yeah. And then you've been in those situations where, what does a customer say in that situation when it's like, hey, they've given you 15 tries to continue on with this?
The question is, what don't they say? It's at that point, it goes back to, it's not usually like a question of being legal or illegal. It's usually a question of people being rational or irrational. And you're usually gotten that far because clearly you've done everything legally you're required to do, but you've got someone who's acting irrationally by continuing to
Gosh,
deny.
what a good word.
So that's what I encounter. Like, well, Judge, they didn't put the blocks right on this one, and they never came and fixed it right. They're like, well, you paid on it for 8 months with it like that, and then you stopped, and then you had it rent-free for another 1.5 years because it's taking this long to get into court. Yeah, well, that doesn't matter. I mean, this is really, they're just, sometimes just grasping at straws. They think that it'll – and also, here's another thing. They've heard and seen this happen before with shed companies, and the shed company has not had a lawyer come in and get it back. So they think that – I've heard them say this in court, like, oh, just drag it out long enough. They won't do anything. They'll let it go. So – I think there's some thought that, hey, well, it's not worth it to them. This building, worth $2,000. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the fair market value, but you also don't lease buildings as your business, so perhaps a company may want to get that back, and that's some things I encounter as well.
Well, and when you case law is setting precedent, right? So, like when you set a precedent as a company that says we won't go after it, sometimes you have to set that. I disciplined my kids early on. You know why I didn't have to spend a whole lot of time disciplining them? Because I disciplined them early on.
That's right. Yeah.
I got
set
the point.
Rules clearly early.
Yes, set the standards quickly so that they were easily understood, and then you could, to your point, talking about rational and irrational. I could rationalize with my children. Mm-hmm. They would understand a little bit farther. I think that's kind of. I mean, to turn, sort of a biblical message to that. That's sort of why we get frustrated, but God talks about life being in the trials and the tribulations. That the faith of a mustard seed is what you use as to get through those trials and tribulations, right? So embrace difficulty. I mean, that's sort of like engage in it and say that's what's actually giving me life. Muscle builds with resistance, right?
That's right.
So
yeah.
I mean, it's. Embrace it. Learn kind of to, even though it's difficult, instead of being like, oh no, I'm falling apart, kind of be like, oh, thank you for the chance to go through something difficult, because this is a chance to learn. And when I go through these difficulties, I'll be better because of it, and I'll be more prepared.
That's right.
Whenever I experience it next time. With customers, so this was a thought that came to my mind. It's maybe a bad segue, but have you had like salespeople in court with you as a representation of like how that conversation has come up? If the customer is part of it, does that ever trickle down to the salesperson to be like, well, he said, she said, and what can you do better as like maybe salespeople who are actually moving these sheds? I'm just trying to think of some advice that we could give to them to learn more.
That's a fantastic question, and I've seen this play out both ways. That folks that represent themselves without a lawyer in court, it gets into the weeds of the he said, she said. And here's why. Because they don't, and right, like you don't know what you don't know. If you're, not a lawyer, you don't know the rules of civil procedure, the filings you have to file. I've never had to have a salesperson appear because we've always had everything filed and there that would save that person from having to come to court, whether it be an affidavit. We've never had to have that actual live. Now, we've had some, back and forth things, but it's never come down to he said, she said, because the contract spoke for it all. We've always had a contract. Mm-hmm. And I've told people before that have come in, I said, look, that don't have the contract, or they have one and then it's kind of sketchy or questionable. I was like, we could do this, but I don't feel as confident with your matter as I would this other person's for X, Y, Z reasons. So I've seen people, like I said, represent themselves, and they're like, well, they told me this. Like, would y'all have the contract? No, we lost it. Would you have a copy? No, we lost it. So you get into that, he said. Mm-hmm. But I've never had one because, I won't go in if I'm not prepared. I'm not going to expose a client. That, oh, yeah, by the way, we're probably going to lose this thing, but if you'll just still pay me afterwards, I'm going to go through the motions and pretend like I'm doing something. Uh-huh. That's, I'm not doing my job. Like, I don't want to, lead a lamb to slaughter, right? And I was like, hey, if I saw something like, you might want to let this one slide. I think the cost of writing this off is probably better than the legal fees you're going to incur and the low likelihood of a successful outcome. Mm-hmm. So there's times I have to give that advice, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's just how it is. So on the front end, it goes back to the beginning, right? Contracts, get it in writing and signed. And, if it does come to a legal dispute where you have to go to court, I do recommend have a lawyer look at it, even if it's just for advice. If you're like, well, I think I can handle this myself. Everybody has that right. You know what I mean? I don't want to force you to tell you got to have a lawyer. Right. The courts will tell you that. It's not true. You don't have to, but it is helpful. and advisable. So.
Sure. I mean, you should be taking advice from someone who's in the profession, and you would in any other thing that you're doing. So why wouldn't you? And I tell you, why not? I think a lot of people fear that, like, oh no, am I going to incur this great cost, or you know what I mean, like that. So that scares them from gaining the information they need. That is just some of the more basic stuff that might actually save them in the end if they get a little bit of information that changes their perception on things.
And I'm guilty of that, like with the doctor stuff. Like I'm the world's worst about putting stuff off of going to the doctor. I just grew up that way. Like unless you're really sick, and it's like, and also now as you're growing up, like, you know, insurance isn't quote unquote insurance. It's like I feel like I'm always paying something every time I go. It's like, well, how do I have insurance?
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like, aren't you supposed to pay this?
Yeah.
You know?
What have you insured me of?
We can do a whole nother podcast of me ripping the insurance industry, but we won't do that for not doing, you know, heaven forbid they do their job when it's time to do their job and pay. But
it's such a controversial topic. I'll get my buddy Tim Hirschberger, or I'm actually getting ready to do an insurance episode here coming up from from a fella in Georgia.
Excellent.
We'll get all you guys together.
Yeah, we'll do it. Hash it out. Have a round table. Just bicker back and forth.
It'll be lots of fun.
Who's the lower rung of the career ladder? Oh, at least I'm not a lawyer.
It'd be a lot of fun. I think they would enjoy it. Lots of fun, man. What's some final thoughts for you? I'm good to go another hour, or I'm good to wrap up. Either way.
Maybe we'd come back for another one sometime. Follow up.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
Much fun. I feel like we could still talk about a lot of stuff. Good wrap up. I would say, you know, no matter what level you are, manufacturer, rent to own, dealer, hauler, all of those, we're all, you know, everyone's in the barn industry, the shed industry, and like we talked about from the beginning. I would like to not have to go to court as much for them. You know what I mean? Like. And I realize you're going to have to do that on the recovery. If you choose, like some people just won't act rationally. It may not be completely illegal, but it is completely irrational, and then you have to go get it. But be on the lookout for any rent-own agreements in which you're either an RTO company involved or, you know, collaterally at some point in the process, particularly in North Carolina and other states. You know, ask questions. Make sure it's up to date. Who wrote it? Like, did you pull it from another state, thinking it would be okay in that state? Start there. You know, there's lots of things I could tell you, but it seems like start with the rent-to-own agreement. Make sure, because that's the one that's going to expose folks at all levels to some serious financial liability if it's, you know, violates certain state statutes, particularly here in North Carolina. So get those checked out, you know.
All good, man. People like to work with people they know. Give me some interesting thoughts on who you are outside of being a lawyer.
Oh, that's my favorite.
People are going to.
That's who I am.
They're going to recognize you as that, and that only maybe.
Yeah, that's right. So I always think when I come into court, and so I just trimmed my beard back, so it was a lot bigger the other week, and I've got the long hair, as you can see. So I always have to have my bar card and ID ready.
We're pretty much twins.
Yeah, pretty much.
Like me and you I would say we look a lot alike.
I just need the suspenders and bow tie on.
Yeah, I think you need about 100 pounds. You need a few meals.
So I go to court sometimes, and the securities, I'll show them, like, you an attorney? I'm like, sometimes, you know, letting them know, like, they think that's kind of funny. I was like, I am today. And, you know, I joke, but I'm also serious, right? Like, so often you meet somebody, oh, what do you do? I was like, my new answer is like, I like to have fun, you know. I just built my kid's tree house. I love doing woodwork in the yard. We got a couple of acres. I've got chickens, a huge garden in the middle. Try to see how much we can grow and store through the winters, you know, like kind of a, you know, little that's miniature homesteading type deal.
Yeah.
Got bees, honeybees out there.
Nice.
Yeah, I love being out, split a lot of firewood. Got a wood stove. You know, up until last year, we had nothing but wood heat. We got an old fixer-upper fixed up. It was built in 1924. Used to be the parsonage for the Methodist church up the road from us.
Okay.
So we redid the pine heart floors, plaster walls, beadboard walls, and ceilings. You know, tried to fix it up as best we could without having to replace. And that's just it. Being home with my family. You know, my wife and little girl, dog, and animals, and being outside.
What do you you read?
I read a lot.
What do you like to read?
Ooh, you name it. I've recently finished this series called Last Kingdom, kind of a like 800s England Viking era, with the Saxons and the Vikings clashing. It was a good historical fiction. Reading this story now called the Overstory. It's about trees and connection with people in different ways. People's lives interact around trees and such.
About 2 years ago, there was a Facebook thread really going around about that that I was following pretty heavily.
Oh, really?
And Brant and me has talked about grounding and different things, and just trying to understand nature a little bit more and how that plays a role into. It's all very interesting.
That's where I plug in. I get outdoors. It just recharges me.
Any interesting hobbies? Any you fly planes? You I don't know. You go hiking. You go running. Anything in particular?
I do hike. All those are pretty standard, right? Generic things you post on your page, right? Oh,
right.
And enjoys walking with his dogs and hiking.
Yeah.
I love hiking and playing with the animals. Beekeeping. But I would say a unique thing is I'm also ordained minister. I could marry you if you need or want.
Is that right?
That's another thing I do. Yeah, I did a wedding last year, a very traditional Celtic type wedding.
Okay.
Here in North Carolina. So that's another thing.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. Really into comic books. Speaking of reading, I've been going back and trying to find old Marvel type comics, read those.
I'm from Metropolis, Illinois, which is the hometown of Superman.
That's right.
So,
That's right. The DC ones. Yeah.
It's the only town supposedly named Metropolis in the country, but it was destinated the hometown of Superman. So we're legit. We got the statue and everything. So
you're the only one because there's no Gotham City for Batman
Yeah.
out there. That's purely fictional.
I like to tell people you'll never see me and Superman, in the same place at the same time. So
That's right.
You never know, folks.
That's right. There's
Just
a phone
saying.
booth right out here too. So if you need to change on your way out,
Well, we're replacing the phone booth with a shed.
there we go.
And now I turn into the Shed
Perfect.
Geek instead of Superman. So I don't know what my powers are yet. I got to figure out what my superpowers are. Communication, I like
Over
it.
mass groups,
Yeah, just invoking communication on massive levels.
That's right.
And all pow bang. Dude, I've enjoyed it.
Same here.
Really getting to know you and having more friends in the shed industry and really creating a larger environment where everyone can be successful. And I feel at home, and there's nothing better than feeling at home the first time we've talked before, but whenever you meet someone and really break bread and engage, and that's a whole new level. So appreciate what you're doing. I wish you nothing but success. Encourage RTO companies to call you, and I encourage
Absolutely.
If you're a mom and pop, great, call. If you're a dealer, if you're a hauler, if you're a manufacturer, call. This dude is so cool, awesome, highly recommended, Shed Geek approved. Give them a call here at Cedar Grove Law. Appreciate you being on the show today.
Oh, thank you. I'm very honored and humbled. Thank you so much.
Right. Talk to you soon.
All right.